at exactly 2:17 a.m., when the entire town should have been asleep. A single scream tore through the silence, sharp enough to wake those who lived closest to the edge of the forest. And when the police arrived less than 10 minutes later, they found something so disturbing that even seasoned officers would later admit it changed the way they slept forever, because whatever happened that night didn't just take one life. It poisoned an entire town with fear that still hasn't faded decades later. And this is the case that terrified an entire town and remains unsolved to this day. The town of Black Hollow was the kind of place people trusted without thinking twice. A quiet community tucked between endless woods and a narrow highway that most drivers sped past without ever stopping. A place where neighbors' waved doors stayed unlocked, and the loudest sounds after dark were usually crickets or the distant whistle of a freight train drifting through the valley. But on the night of October 14th, 1998, that calm sense of safety shattered beyond repair. The victim was 27-year-old Emily Carter, a local elementary school teacher, known for her warmth, routine-driven lifestyle, and deep roots in the town. Someone whose life followed predictable patterns so consistent that when she didn't show up for work that morning, co-workers knew immediately that something was wrong. Emily lived alone in a modest white house on Ridge Lane, less than half a mile from the forest line, and according to friends and family, she had no known enemies, no history of conflict, and no reason to believe she was in danger, which is exactly what made the crime so haunting. On the evening before her death, Emily followed the same routine she always did, leaving school around 4:30 p.m., stopping at a local grocery store where multiple witnesses later confirmed seeing her buying soup and bread, waving to the cashier she'd known since childhood, and then driving straight home, a drive that took no more than 7 minutes. And for the next few hours her movements were pieced together through phone records, neighbor statements, and a faint trail of normalcy that would later feel cruel in hindsight. At 6:48 p.m. she spoke to her sister on the phone, discussing plans for a weekend visit, laughing, sounding relaxed, with no indication of fear, distress, or suspicion. And that phone call would become the last confirmed contact anyone ever had with her. Sometime between 11 o'clock p.m. and 2:17 a.m., someone entered Emily Carter's life and turned it into a nightmare. There were no signs of forced entry at her home, no broken windows, no damaged doors, nothing that suggested a struggle had occurred inside, which led investigators to believe she either knew her killer or willingly opened the door. But what they found outside told a very different story. Emily's body was discovered near the tree line behind her house, partially concealed by fallen leaves, positioned in a way that immediately raised alarms, because it felt deliberate, staged, almost ritualistic. A word investigators avoided publicly, but used privately more than once. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, indicating she fought back, and deep bruising around her wrists suggested restraint, but there was no murder. Weapon found at the scene, no usable fingerprints, and no footprints that could be tracked due to heavy leaf cover and recent rainfall. The most chilling detail, the one officers would later describe as the moment they realized this case was different, was a single object placed carefully beside her. Body, a small, carved, wooden symbol unfamiliar to local law enforcement, something that didn't belong in Black Hollow, something no one could immediately identify, and something that appeared again later in ways no one expected. The investigation began with urgency, roadblocks, and door-to-door interviews. And for the first 48 hours, fear spread faster than facts. Parents kept children home from school, businesses closed early, and whispers filled grocery aisles and church pews, all fueled by one terrifying question: if Emily Carter could be taken, who was safe? Police started with the obvious, looking into Emily's personal life, her dating history, her workplace, and anyone who had access to her home, but every path seemed to lead to nothing. Co-workers described her as cautious, and private friends said she had recently ended a casual relationship months earlier without incident. And family insisted she had no secrets, yet the lack of answers only made the pressure heavier. One of the first suspects was a local handyman, a man in his early 40s who had done minor repairs at Emily's house several weeks prior, someone who knew the property layout and the wooded area behind it. But after extensive questioning and an airtight alibi placing him over an hour away that night, he was cleared, though his name would continue circulating in town rumors for years. Another lead focused on the forest itself, a vast, poorly mapped stretch of land where hunters, hikers, and the occasional drifter passed through unnoticed, raising the disturbing possibility that the killer wasn't from Black Hollow at all, but a transient predator who struck and vanished. Yet that theory began to crumble when forensic analysis revealed something critical. Emily had been moved only a short distance from her home, meaning her killer felt comfortable, unhurried, and familiar enough with the area to operate without fear of interruption. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. And despite countless interviews, tip lines flooded with speculation, and evidence processed with the best resources available at the time, the case stalled. But the town didn't heal, because fear without resolution doesn't fade, it festers. Then, 6 months later, something happened that reopened every wound. In a neighboring town nearly 30 miles away, hikers discovered another body near a wooded trail, and beside it, unmistakably, was the same carved wooden symbol. The victim, 22-year-old college student Rachel Moore, had no connection to Emily Carter, no ties to Black Hollow, and lived a very different life. But the similarities in how the bodies were placed were impossible to ignore. Suddenly, police were no longer dealing with a single tragic murder, but a potential serial offender. And panic spread again, now wider, now louder. A joint task force was formed, state investigators were brought in, and the press swarmed both towns, turning quiet streets into backdrops for live broadcasts, while residents watched their sense of anonymity dissolve under the glow of camera lights. The carved symbol became central to the investigation, with experts consulted from outside the state, yet no definitive origin was ever determined. Some suggested it resembled ancient folklore markings. Others claimed it was meaningless, invented, a signature meant only to taunt. But whatever its purpose, it became a psychological weapon, reminding everyone that the killer wanted to be remembered. Despite renewed effort, mistakes were made early, tips weren't followed thoroughly, evidence handling standards of the late 90s limited what could be preserved, and internal disagreements between agencies slowed progress at crucial moments, a fact acknowledged years later in internal reviews, but never fully explained to the public. One particularly promising suspect emerged when a man was arrested for an unrelated violent offense and found to possess carvings similar in style to the symbol. But after months of investigation, forensic inconsistencies, and a lack of direct linkage forced prosecutors to let him go, a decision that devastated families and fueled accusations of incompetence. As the years passed, the case grew cold, but it never stopped haunting Black Hollow, because residents kept seeing patterns, strange figures near the forest, unexplained noises at night. And whether those sightings were real or products of collective trauma didn't matter, because fear had become part of daily life. Memorials were held every October, candles lit and silent speeches given that ended without answers, and children who grew up hearing the story learned early that monsters didn't always live in stories, sometimes they walked among you unnoticed. Today, more than 2 decades later, advances in forensic technology have reopened the case once again. DNA testing previously impossible is being attempted, evidence re-examined, and investigators remain cautiously hopeful. But they also acknowledge a truth no one wants to say out loud, that the killer may have lived a full life, unseen, unpunished, carrying those secrets to the grave. The questions remain heavy and unanswered. Was the killer someone local hiding behind normalcy, or a stranger passing through at precisely the wrong moment? Was the carved symbol a confession, a warning, or something more personal? And most chilling of all, did the killer ever stop? The town of Black Hollow still locks its doors at night, still watches the tree line when the wind is just a little too loud, and still remembers the night innocents died, because unresolved evil leaves scars deeper than any solved crime. This has been Midnight Crime Vault, where shadows don't lie and silence speaks volumes. And now, we ask you, who do you believe was behind these murders? And why were they never caught? Share your theories below. And if you want to continue exploring the darkest cases that history left behind, make sure to subscribe to Midnight Crime Vault for more stories that refuse to stay buried.